Okay, say something.
Hello. Adventure.
Love.
Connection.
Risk.
Passion.
Evolution.
Play.
Life. The Archetypal Tarot Podcast. Provocative mythology for the 21st century.
Hello, podcast listeners. This is Julienne, and this last podcast of 2015 is a conversation that I had with my dear friend and mentor, Jim Curtan. Jim is a spiritual director, archetypal counselor, and retreat leader. He was also a Hollywood talent manager for many years. He's the person that I learned the whole symbolic language of archetypes and movie from, and we both share a passion for film, and so we dug into a pretty wide-ranging conversation of movies, archetypes, and specifically what's represented in the Tower card. And we hope you enjoy this special edition of the Archetypal Tarot Podcast. So let us know what you think. Find us on Twitter or Facebook. You can find the show notes at archetypist.com/change. And on that page, you will find a special discount code for a really amazing audio course that Jim has put out called Embracing the Grace of Change. And we think you will really like it. And you're going to save 20%. So visit the show page at archetypist.com/change. Thanks so much.
So hi, Jim, and welcome to our humble little podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Julienne, and thank you for inviting me.
I'm sincerely excited to have you on this show. A lot of feedback that we've gotten from the audiences so far really appreciate us when we talk about film. And we have done the major arcana from the Fool all the way through the world and done a show for each one. And with each one, I would mention not only the archetypes in the tarot cards and the major arcana, but also some films that we thought related both to characters as well as the archetypal situations. And I'm just going to say it now, I owe you a huge debt of gratitude for learning a lot of that language and that really just ability to see things in a way and look at things archetypally, especially with film. I've learned so much from you, not to embarrass you, but a huge part of that has really just been learning through you and Carolyn Mesa's School.
I don't mind being embarrassed in this way.
Oh, good. Well, it's wonderful, and I thought it would be kind of fun to talk about the archetypes in the tarot card, which is the Tower, which many people consider one of the spookiest, most superstitious. It shows up in a spread, and it's like, it's the ending of something. It's chaos and crumbling. I listened back to the show that we did almost 3 years ago about the Tower, and I was listening back to what I talked about in terms of film. And I referenced a number of things. One of them was Castaway, which you taught a number of years ago at CMed. And I also talked about The Hunger Games. And I know those are two films that you have written about before, and also I know you teach Castaway. So what are your thoughts of the relationship of the meaning behind the Tower card and those films?
Well, the Castaway, is one of my 2 or 3 favorite films to teach. And what it looks to me like in that film is the shattering of the reality I knew. That the reality that Tom Hanks knows at the beginning of the movie is completely shattered. All of his suppositions, all of his assumptions about life and what is of value is shattered by that. And when, by the end of the film, it's his notion of what is of value is completely changed. What's destroyed in it are, I say in the kind of teaching that I do, that this teaching taken seriously will strip you of your illusions and rob you of your excuses. And I think that this is what happens when that collapse happens. There's I think Richard Rohr is the first person I heard say this, is that we spend the first half of our lives leaning our ladder against climbing the ladder of success, and then we get to the top and realize we've put the ladder against the wrong wall. And so what in Castaway is important is the destruction of a false god. People wouldn't think of this maybe, but Tom Hanks in that movie is an idolater. He worships time. He's made time and efficiency his god. The slogan on the FedEx box is "the world on time." Well, that's the kind of chronos time that devours us. Do you know that that's just the time that eats us? So what happens to him? He's put in a place where there is no time, and it's very hard even to keep track of time. And so the god of time is useless to him on that island.
That's perfect.
The worship of time. And I think in the Hunger Games, I'm not as familiar with that, but what intrigues me about that and so many other of these young adult novels that are becoming films is that they're dystopian. That these are movies about, they're almost prophetic in the sense of the center cannot hold. That the towers that we've built, whether it's in the Hunger Games or
Divergent,
they can't hold. They can't hold. They're really predictive of what's going on in our political election this year. Very much, it seems to me. It's, I think, why on one side of it you have Donald Trump and on the other Bernie Sanders. Because they keep building this Trump Tower. Yeah, think of it as Trump Tower.
Yeah.
And it can't, it's like the Tower of Babel. It can't just keep rising. What's fascinating to me about this is that if I had to say one thing about him, I could say it about several of the candidates, but it's so clear to me about him. There's no introspection. There's no questioning of choices ever, or the admission that we grow by our choices and mistakes. And so this tower just keeps getting built bigger and bigger and bigger. And to get that big, it has to get heavy and heavy and heavy, top heavy. I won't make jokes about him being top heavy. There, I just did. But the reason I think that young people are so drawn to Bernie Sanders, these are the young people that can see in what he's doing, leading a rebellion against the forces in things like the Hunger Games and Divergent and The Giver. All of these. And all of them, to some degree, are rooted in the Wizard of Oz. If you see what's behind the curtain, the only difference is what's behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz is relatively harmless. What's behind the curtain in these dystopian movies is really pollution and evil. In fact, what's amazing as you talk about it with the tower is in those dystopian movies, a small group of people think it's their job to control everything else. And how they control it is with scarcity and the removal of choices. And if you look at this election right now, I hope you don't mind my talking about politics. I'm addicted to this. I wish I didn't have a TV, but I do. But there's the whole notion of choice. And I don't just mean in terms of Planned Parenthood, but the whole notion of choice is on the line in this election in so many different ways. It's whether we empower you to choose or we choose for you because we know better. And that's what the young people in these dystopian novels, they don't buy it.
It's a part of a cycle, that there's a destruction of the paradigm, the storyline it has been so far, and often before that, or as actually a part of the whole process, it seems that this tower-like, building and then, the destruction of it is a part of the process. It just doesn't take sometimes it takes a decade, right? I just went to you at CMed, or Rick Tarnas, who's the author of Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche. He lectured at the school years ago, and he was talking about the Pluto. He looks at it in astrological terms of the was it Pluto and Uranus, those cyclical changes that we've seen time and time again, and the revolution, evolution processes that we can see. The most recently in the 1960s and the upheaval happening then, and we've been in this period for quite some time now. At least since 2005, 2006. So it's almost a decade. And the effects of this, and whether you want to, whether you believe there's a causal relationship or not, historically we see these epochs, and the politics are definitely showing that as well. There's such an incredible lack of civility in politics, to the point that most of us can't remember a time when there was civility in politics, and that to me is kind of scary, because it's become the new norm. But what you say about the destruction of the false gods, and the idea of the looking at the Hunger Games in this almost science fiction dystopian destruction, is that what comes out of it for me is there's a great deal of potentiality on the other side of that.
What we're seeing also is the archetype of the bully. It's interesting with Pope Francis, who is not a bully at all, combating the bullying of the traditional bullying of the hierarchical church. And if you look at Donald Trump, he's a bully. And the leaders in the Hunger Games are bullies. And so what we're doing is put together the bully and the false god.
Yeah.
And that authentic divinity is not a bully. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's the lover, among other things, but it's going from the bully. What I went to get in my room was a book I think I've shown you, and I'm not all the way through it. Very heavy going. It's called Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism. And I just flashed to the chapter on the tower, and I'm not there yet. But this writer, who is a monk, says the tower is about the dark night of the soul also. And it has to do, there's a mystical quality in it, because what happens is reality is shattered, that disillusionment. There is a shattering of what we thought was true and trusted to be true. And we're still here, but our coordinates aren't, which is very much what happens to Tom Hanks. He's put in a place where none of his coordinates are relevant. And so I think this has to do with this chaos too. And that's very much true of the Dark Knight. It's not that anything is wrong particularly. You're no longer where you were, and you don't know where you are.
Yeah. And the necessarily difficult process of letting those illusions go, because I think it's fairly easy for most people to, even if they've gone through a major tower-like upheaval, is to go back and cling to what they know, what is comfortable, because it's what we felt feels right. Even that sort of like, well, intuitively I know this feels right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are in the place that you need to be, or the things that are surrounding you. So running back and to try to recreate that tower, right? And I think in the last podcast we had talked about the Buddhist myth of the gentleman who created his. He literally had to build a tower every week, and his great teacher would knock it down. And that was part of his lesson.
Yeah.
So, at first he defended it, right? He had to defend that tower, and then it would get knocked down by lightning striking it. And that is breaking of those illusions eventually, even though it's going to be painful, is completely necessary. And I wanted to bring something up too, because, and I wanted to get your feelings on this based on what you're saying, is if you look at the major arcana, the Fool, 0 through 22, which is the world, this tower happens closer towards the end. It's card 16. And what precedes it is the devil, which we look at very much as addiction, but also, the positive side of that is the Dionysian, revelry and enjoyment, and, the sensual, pure, so like a bodily enjoyment, but also with, the devil, there's addiction, right? Being chained, being a slave to that. The next card's the Tower, which we're discussing now. And what comes after that is the Star, the archetype of finding your true north, the true path, and that there is the process of you can't get to the star without what you have built before, which might or might not have served you. All of that goes away, and what you end up walking with, if you embrace it, is all of those skills and relationships that have made it through that process and have become enriched. Yeah.
There's another piece to this that is true in all the great myths, is that the road to heaven leads through hell.
Exactly.
That there's no roundabout. There's no, you can't go around hell, you have to go through it. That's true in the Odyssey, it's true in the Gospels. You have to go through this hell which is a cleansing, really. It's part of the hero's journey, really, is you have to go through hell. It's funny, I just opened this book, and again, I haven't read the whole book yet, but it says that the 15th, the devil is about, and I love this as a description of addiction, it's the intoxication of counter-inspiration.
That makes a lot of sense. Then the numbing.
Yeah, it's advertising, really.
Yeah.
Where you want something that you're seduced into wanting something that you don't need and don't really want.
And by necessity, the process of the breaking down of the tower, and for our own, within our own psyche, that process. And I like that you brought in the dark night of the soul, and I think many times it is. I've experienced a few that I call the dark night of the ego, which is kind of a tower process where those who you think you are in terms of the self, lowercase, gets stripped away, but it's the ego that takes those hits. And my sense is that the soul is completely strong and present, but it's that ego that stands in front of it that by necessity has to break down.
Yeah, it does, because, the ego will try, when we have those shocks of self-realization, the ego will say, don't tell anybody. We can keep this going if you just keep your mouth shut.
It's terribly embarrassing.
It is, yeah, please. Yes, it's okay if you and I know you're a fake, but for God's sake, keep it to yourself, or our plan will be ruined. So that's, I think that's part of what goes on too, is when, and I don't know these characters well, but in the Hunger Games, when, what's the heroine's name?
Katniss.
Katniss's authenticity starts to awaken people who are in the hierarchies of power. They've not been encountered authenticity. They haven't encountered the real. And it shocks them.
And it's an incredible threat.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, it's very difficult to control people when they're all being authentic.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot more about, you know way more about the tarot than I do, but I can see the archetypal connections to a lot of this. And always the tarot reminds me of the hero's journey.
We talk about it as an alternative in a way, that they are while there are a lot of relationships between a lot of the stages, you can essentially map a lot of what Campbell talked about in the hero's journey to the tarot. And in a previous podcast earlier this year with Craig Chalkwist, who is a depth psychology professor, amongst many other things, deeply steeped in mythology, we talked about just calling it the taroic journey, because he used to teach the the hero's journey. But the taroic journey, the more I've been working with this, and this is especially the 5 years of this podcast, to me it is a much richer, inclusive story that we can work with, because for a lot of reasons, partly because it includes a lot of the feminine archetypal, and directly a feminine archetypal, and I think that's to the benefit of everyone, no matter their gender. But it also has a lot to do with relationship all the way through. I mean, certainly some of them really are more about the character and the individual, but if you look at it as a story, and you can mix these cards up and tell the story any number of different ways, but I do think there is a beauty of the 0 through the 22, the Fool to the World, that is about connectivity, community, and relationship, which is really what I think is terribly missing, and that's our greatest cultural, personal growth place, is in connection and relationship, which is
I would make an argument that the hero's journey is really largely one of individuation, and that you can't be in relationship until you complete that part. So because the hero's journey is about me, what I want to accomplish. It's in King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, they say the hero is an intermediate archetype, that it's not a permanent one, that it's the hero's journey is one from immaturity to maturity. And to be in relationship, real relationship, you have to have achieved a certain degree of maturity and individuation. And I don't think that the tarot is a much older set of myths and symbols than the hero's journey in terms, Campbell's
interpretation of it,
Campbell's interpretation of which is wonderful. But the thing about Campbell, or any of these teachers, is that Campbell offers us a way of seeing. He doesn't say this is the way of seeing. It's like my dear friend Carolyn Mace. Her model is a very rich way of seeing. But if you make it the way of seeing, the gospel of seeing, it loses its power. All of these people who teach us ways of seeing, these are lenses through which we see. They're not what we see. They're the lenses, and the tarot is a lens. Archetypes are lenses and they're lenses that help us to organize experience and give it meaning. But there's not just one meaning. So if I do this, I will know the meaning of life. No, you won't.
No.
That's a secret. But there are these ways of seeing, these models of seeing. Richard Rohr's models for seeing are exquisite, very, very rich. And there are other teachers I've been with, but people start to, here's the challenge with both the tarot or astrology or any of these things, is that these are symbols that are interpretive symbols, and if we try to take them literally, they have no power, they have no use. So what I watch is when people are learning sacred contracts and archetypal wheels, or any of these tools, they're so determined to find the right way to read them. Like the right way to read the tarot cards. Like there is a right way.
Right.
And these are not black and white. They are interpretive, and they're reflective, and they're intuitive. And you can't read them the way you would read a math problem and come up with the right answer, the right solution. And any of these tools in the hands of people that think there's a right solution, well, then you'll have a tarot fundamentalist.
Yeah.
Or you'll have a tarot and mace fundamentalist. And it's like, if you're a fundamentalist Christian, you can't possibly comprehend the dark night of the soul. It's just not possible, because it's in symbols, and it's not possible with the interior castle. It's not possible with Rumi, with any of these people who speak in images and symbols. A literal Muslim can't comprehend Rumi any more than a literal Christian can comprehend John of God. You just can't, because you're reducing it to Chronos, and A plus B equals C. And that's not, they don't see that way. That's not what they're saying. It's an interesting thing about the tarot, is that it is a guide into an insolvable mystery. That the thing about God is that you can know God and not know God, because you can't ever exhaust it. It's a mystery, any more than you can know yourself completely, because we're a mystery, not one that's solved, but the one that we get greater insights into, that we have aha moments that take us deeper, but don't exhaust. You can't exhaust the tarot. You can't exhaust the archetypes, because they're not linear, and they're not finite, and they're not meant to be. Once I go through the Grand Arcana?
Major Arcana.
Once I go through the major arcana, well, there you go. It's like the 12 steps. Well, once I get through the 12 steps, I'll have this addiction licked. But each time through, each reflection on the tarot or the archetypes or astrology approached wisely holds up a mirror of sorts that is a reflection that can give us insight, sometimes revelation, into what's going on with our lives. But it's not a resolution. It's not an answer.
We hope you're enjoying this episode, and we invite you to become a part of the Archetypal Tarot team by becoming a patron. It's super easy, and there are some awesome rewards for joining. So just visit tiny.cc/tarot for more information. And now back to our program.
No, to me it's the power of this. It's the power of story, and we were actually just talking about the fundamentalism of anything, which there's fundamentalists for everything, from scientists to Christians to tarot fundamentalists, and I don't think any of the previous podcasts that Sundar and I have hosted have been. We never really directly addressed it, but we certainly talked about the symbolic movements and the potentialities and meanings, and also to really look at each stage as, reminding people that these things are, in a way, they're both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, and they allow us to connect to each other. If we're, if you're able to see something symbolically, that, you're going through this process, that maybe it was incredibly difficult, or it required more of you than you ever thought you could, or it put you into relationship where things were, either joyful or awful, that this is a part of the process. I think, to me, having models like the tarot and others helps us integrate things into our lives. That this isn't, it basically works with the victim archetype to kind of pull you out of the, oh, poor me, this was done to me, to a more integrative, this is included in the process of life. a lot of times when I've been learning with you, really embracing, the moment where you embrace the grief and gratitude at the
Yeah.
same time, where you can, that paradox of the two at the same time. I think our ability to see things symbolically and to use a model as like astrology or the tarot to help us integrate it and be empowered by it versus just say, well, that was awful. I'm going to shut down. My life is over. Which leads me to another film that I really, really wanted to talk about with you. And that is a film from a number of years ago called The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel.
I love Patel. I love that. Oh, I don't know the hotel, but I love the movie.
I don't know. I don't know that there is an actual hotel, but just to set this up for our listeners a little bit, this is a film directed, I believe, by John Madden. It came out in 2011 and has this stellar cast, I think, anyway. If you like Judi Dench, if you like Maggie Smith, Bill Nighy, I mean, it's an ensemble film. It had Dev Patel, who was the star of Slumdog Millionaire, a very Oscar-winning film. But Jim, I remember seeing this film, and I recommend everybody who's listening to this podcast watch this film. It is lovely, and it really does embody a lot of what's happening in the tower, the star, and there's a lot of the journey happening there, and it happens in a way that I think is lovely because it centers around a young couple in India, but also a set of septuagenarians. These are people who, they are in their retirement, or what's supposed to be their retirement. And the story is woven together, and the story is told, I think, in just such a beautiful way. And Jim, you have just put out a course that talks about this film, and it's called Embracing the Grace of Change. And I think it's a brilliant title. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about the details of the film or the storyline and kind of what it meant to you?
Well, the details are these people who the story of their lives, as they've lived them, no longer work. They've outlived their stories. They've outlived the myths or they're at a point when they didn't think they were going to have to deal with this kind of a challenge, in retirement, where what you thought you knew is no longer true. For example, Judi Dench, she's a damsel. Her husband never bothered her with finances, and he dies, and she finds out she has nothing. Maggie Smith is like the ultimate British woman, but the woman she's the British woman of, that Britain doesn't exist anymore. And what is her way of it's sort of like Maggie Smith's England would be like our America if we lived it like Leave It to Beaver. It's that anymore. And there's a couple in there who lose their retirement savings and are also confronted with age when they move, when they're asked, do you want railings here, here, and here to help you get around so you don't fall? I mean, it's just, and then there's, you had mentioned Tom Wilkinson, but he's carried a shame and a heartbreak and lived his whole life around this thing only to discover it's not true. But he's punished himself for something that isn't true. But he's made up this story, and I think what to me is important with embracing the grace of change, or you could say the grace of chaos, because their lives are all thrown into chaos. And what better symbol for chaos is India? Yeah, India is chaos. I was privileged to visit India, and it's really not describable, and it can't be prepared for, at least by, Midwestern. Yeah. But there's an embrace of life there. I've told this story, but to you, we were going into Jaipur, and the middle of rush hour, although you can't tell when it's not rush hour, but they told us this was rush hour. And I mean, we're seeing things like people sitting cross-legged on the tops of buses and having conversations as they rock back and forth in a way that looks really perilous to me. You see 3 or 4 kids in school uniforms on a motor scooter. You see somebody ride by on a camel or an elephant, and they're all in the same road. And then I see coming up behind me a motor scooter, and a man's driving it, and as it gets closer, you can see there's a woman on the back of it, and she's wearing a sari, so she's riding side saddle. And he's weaving in and out of traffic like a motorcyclist would here when you use the white line. And as they get closer, we realize she's nursing her child. And totally in rhythm with his driving, totally in rhythm with the traffic. Now, in this country, they would be arrested for child endangerment. The baby should have had a helmet and the seat should have been backwards. Well, they all should have had helmets.
The baby wouldn't be on this scooter here.
I know, no, of course not. And so what happens is that I had this realization, you have to step around cows, and you have to, you step around things that are unbelievable. And what I get that in our culture, to me, we're a culture of fear, and they just live life. Life's life. We everything we're told all the time. Look at the commercials. That life is dangerous. You can't think of life as dangerous as you're in India. It's just life is life, because it goes on, and they do things as a matter of course that look like Cirque du Soleil acts, some of them. I mean, so what happens, it really is chaos to a Westerner for whom structure and tidiness are so important. And it's really overwhelming to go there. And all of these people that go there, they're all in their 70s. They have to deal with this and respond to it or die. I've told you this too. I was diagnosed with cancer. I can't believe it's 18 years ago. And one of my doctors said, Jim, I believe cancer is a challenge to change or die. And a lot of people are more afraid of change than death. And I said, I'm going to try change. But I've come to believe that isn't just about being diagnosed with a terminal illness or, a chronic illness, whatever it is, that we're being asked to change or die all the time. If we don't change, our spirits die. To the extent we resist change of the way things are going, we calcify.
Yeah, and I think the film, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, is really, because it is an ensemble cast, you get to see diversity in how each of them deals with it. So they all essentially, with the exception of Dev Patel and his fiancée, all the elderly, as it were, the older people in it, they all initially have the same situation where the plans they had made awry. The tower struck, the lightning struck. They all really don't have any choices.
Right.
And they all end up in the same plane. They're on their way to India, and this is their only recourse, is to basically retire in India, where it is so much cheaper, the healthcare, etc., things like that. So, but how each of them deals with it and how they voice what is going on for them, the diversity of those reactions, I thought was, to me, the most instructive and the most interesting. And the course that you've put together, full disclosure, I'm the producer of the course, the course you put together is a really wonderful way for us to embrace the fact that, the plans that we make today could be swept off the table, in an hour, in a week.
And I wouldn't exclude Dev Patel's character, Sunny, from this, because when you see The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel for the first time, it looks like a crumbled tower.
That is true.
Great disrepair, and his life his life is like that Buddhist god you were talking about, Malepura. Is that how you say it?
Milarepa, yeah.
Dev Patel's, he has to rebuild his every day. There's always something the matter. And there's one crisis after another, if not from his mother, his girlfriend's brother. There's one crisis after another. And what's brilliant at the end of that is, and I haven't thought of it that way till just now, when he's sitting on a bench with Judi Dench, and he says, well, I have to wait till the crises. I'm interpreting it. I can't tell her I love her until we resolve all these crises. Well, they're never going to be resolved. So if you wait to tell the girl you love her until there aren't any crises, you'll never tell her you love her. Because his karma is that things will... And he's very much the holy fool. I love his character. The more I watch the movie, the more I realize he holds it together. Judi Dench's narrative is rich, but Sonny propels it forward. And he never gives up. Oh, look, the tower's fallen down. Oh, well, let's build a tower. Oh, he never he gets close to despairing when he talks to Judi Dench. But as he says, everything turns out all right in the end. If it's not all right, it's not the end. Which is, I think, the only way to approach the crushing tower. That you can look at it as the end, or as, oh, well, we better try something else. We better, and it's the thing about that tower, if I follow this image in a crazy way, when the tower collapses, oh my gosh, we don't have the architectural blueprint, so we're going to have to rebuild it the best way we can, and not the pieces are going to fit.
Exactly.
And you're going to leave some of them behind.
And at some point, maybe that, and I'm definitely in a place in my life where I'm seeing the old architecture no longer really working. That as scary as it is, the diving through, as I think Judi Dench in her voiceover says something about, you'll either be crushed by the wave or you dive into it.
Yeah. I even look at this tower right now. I'm at an age where I'd like to simplify my tower. The tower that I live in is too big and requires more maintenance than I would like. But I look at, how do I disassemble this tower without abandoning it or something, because I'm at an age where I need to simplify, which all of those people in Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, they could be trapped in the tower if it didn't shatter.
And I think there's one character in it, Jean, Mrs. Ainsley. She is, of all of the characters, the one that's most obviously clinging with, her white knuckles onto the picture of the life that she thought was owed to her, and her entitlement throughout the film. And she's just... for me, I have a great deal of compassion for her, but also at the same time, she's just miserable, and she makes everyone miserable around her. She's just angry that the story that she thought she would live is gone. And that, to me, is it's like she is the warning. She's the bellwether of, be careful.
If I can return it to something, we have a substantial part of our country and our culture who is Jean. That they're furious that it hasn't turned out the way they thought it would, and they need somebody to blame. She does it with her husband. She can't see her part in it, so it's all his fault. He's a fool, he's a failure. And we see that this is a real crisis. I don't think just in the States, but it's a real crisis. There are a strong minority of Jeans.
Of all ages, too, and that's...
Yes, of course. And the idea of doing it a different way, of seeing a different way through. I was thinking of a moment when, if in a shipwreck you hold on to the pieces of the boat to float, but Jean is holding on to a block of cement and expecting it to float, and that's not its nature. And
that to me, there's something that's been in a conversation with a lot lately with with friends is looking at the current, what the culture talks about and what you see of the way people are raising their children or the way they're approaching life, that difficulty is to be absolutely avoided.
Yeah.
Awkwardness. I mean, we really made, this language of awkward, and there's this, the opposite of awkward is grace. In linguistically, you're either graceful or you're awkward, and that we've made awkward the worst thing that can ever happen. And to me,
Yeah.
that's ego language, because you're uncomfortable, you've done something that you're embarrassed, there's humiliation, and that it is the thing to be avoided, or any painful experience. There's the trend of the trigger warning. And I say this with compassion, that it is, we will be triggered by things, and will be very, very they can be very difficult to deal with, right? But
Yeah. And well, you talk about awkward and grace, and I like to talk about certainty and confusion. And people who live in certainty are unteachable. They're incapable of learning because they're certain that everything is the way they believe it to be. People who are confused are teachable. So when the tower falls, if you can embrace the confusion and learn from the confusion, you will grow. If you say, this can't be right, the tower wasn't supposed to fall, and I'm going to stand in this position where the tower is supposed to be until the tower reconsiders, well, it won't happen. There's one other thing. I know we don't have much time, but I went to see Inside Out a second time.
Oh,
I saw
good.
I saw it the first time with a friend of mine who totally didn't get it. But what I realized the second time, and it shocked me, is that joy is an addict. And it has to be happy and positive all the time. And this goes to grief and gratitude, that it takes her through the whole, she's afraid of all the emotions that she can't control, that would cause her to have to be reflective, to have to examine things, so that by the end, when those little crystals are blue and gold, and you have grief and gratitude together. But I didn't realize how manic joy was. If ever there was a 7 on the Enneagram, it's joy. And I mean, she's hyper. She's hyper. It's like she's had too much sugar, or something else. And so it was fascinating for me to see that, because that movie's about there are 5 towers that collapse in that movie.
True. Exactly.
I hadn't thought about that till this minute. You should never cut me loose with an image.
Yeah.
But
keep talking, Jim. This is great stuff.
but if you look at it, joy has all of those towers neatly, beautifully decorated. And then the little girl, the tower comes up, change that she can't manage. And her whole life has collapsed. It's shattered. And the pins that held it together, the pillars of family and
relationship, friendship.
Whatever.
Yeah.
What?
Friendship,
they all shatter. And joy has no idea what to do about this, because it never occurred to her that everything wouldn't always be happy. And when the little girl at the end says that I'm sad, and I know I'm not, I love this, I know you don't want me to be sad. I know I'm not supposed to be sad. I'm supposed to be your happy girl. It's just the second time through, it just moved me, really moved me, because all of those towers, or I like to think of it as the four legs that hold the stool up,
Mm-hmm.
And they shatter, and we can't stand. And joy, what's interesting about joy is she's trying to put it back the way it was. And when that imaginary friend lets go, you can't put it back the way it was, and you're not supposed to. And he gets it. Yeah, that's a brilliant movie about the tower.
It is. That's an excellent point. I've been thinking about that film a lot lately. I've only seen it the once, but I really, really, really want to see it again. And it's funny because I got part of what you're talking about in the relationship of between joy and sadness in the film, and the fact that I found myself in the film rooting for joy, right? Because that's what we do, and especially in our culture, that like, and I kept, you see sadness kind of starting to touch things and turning them blue. She's adding her sadness to them, and I'm like, don't do that. Don't. And it's the same thing that joy does. She pulls her away and says, here's the little circle that you're in. So psychologically, she's going to compartmentalize. She never wants to get rid of her, though, which I think was a really brilliant way to handle it in the film.
It's like Robert Bly's book about the shadow, where he says, let's just put sadness in that bag that we're going to carry on our back and don't know that it's there.
Exactly. I was so happy and so surprised to see that film. And actually, it was interesting enough, I got to see it on the Pixar campus. And so some of the filmmakers came out and talked about the film ahead of time. And the woman who was the production manager, she said, I've seen this film, like, I cannot tell you how many times from beginning to end. And she says, do you know what, to this day, every time I see this movie, I find something new.
Sure.
And she didn't talk about what the movie was going to be thematically, but she talked about sort of the ideas behind certain parts of the structures, like those islands, the towers. And then after I saw the film, I cried like a baby, of course. I realized that the main point that I think is really, really important in our times is honoring of all of it. Everything, the sadness, the anger, and that we worship joy like the character in the film, and we worship happiness as being the only thing that's really valuable, and that all the other ones we can just deal with those in order to support, this happy, joyous feeling, and that we will literally demonize anything that is difficult or awkward, and we don't integrate it. We're not integrating it, and it's not valued, and there's trigger warnings about everything, and don't let your child go through anything difficult, and that just scares me a little bit. I don't think we can be in relationship with each other and go through the evolution I think we're pulled to if we aren't working with all of these difficult things.
Well, I have one of my closest friends, one of the people I most respect in the world, a man named Skip Chasey. He is a grief counselor. I mean, he was trained as one, particularly during the worst of the AIDS crisis. And he said this to me, and it makes so much sense, is all change brings loss, and all loss must be grieved. And if we don't grieve it, we can't integrate it into who we are. And so even good changes, like going off to the college of your dreams, you're going to grieve leaving your family at home or your friends, it's change. So all of it, getting elected president of the United States brings the loss of the freedom to drive a car. And great, we're going to be on an island where I can actually drive a car. Yay. So that grief, there's always loss with any change, no matter how positive the change. And unless we recognize that and respect it, which I think in Marigold Hotel, Judi Dench's character does the best. It's interesting when she calls her family, and they love her, but they're basically her past. They're not relevant. I mean, she loves them, but there's no life for her there, and she probably never would have predicted that.
No, and you can't. And I think that being present through the process is something that is really, it's nicely shown in that film specifically. Being present with, that grief and that loss. And we actually are taken through that with the loss of one of the characters in the film.
But also when she hangs up the phone after talking to her family and says, I didn't realize it was 11 o'clock. I'm sorry. And when she leaves that phone booth, she's grieving. And they do grieve the loss of one of their friends. And, the funny guy, I can't think of his name, but Norman's grieving Norman and his counterpart are grieving the loss of youth. You know, and that's something to be grieved. I'll tell you. Let me tell you. But it's being able to embrace the change, to be able to say yes to it, and to discover the grace in it. There's grace in chaos, just like there's grace in our wounds. So, but if we go there, we'll never finish this.
No,
So,
I know. I think that's a good place to leave it. The honoring just the sheer amount of loss that we have in our lives, and to me, what is most valuable is just that, honoring it and making it, including it. Getting our arms around it, as difficult as that is. There is so much that comes with that.
yeah,
That
I agree.
connects us to each other, and the compassion that we can have. If you could empower that in yourself, you have more compassion for other people. So it is included. There is the light and the dark together, and it's not necessarily gray, but it is distinct and integrated at the same time.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to become a part of the Archetypal Tarot team by becoming one of our patrons. Our patrons are awesome. So if you're interested, visit tiny.cc/tarot for more information and the awesome rewards for joining. That's tiny.cc/tarot. Thanks for listening to the Archetypal Tarot podcast. If you'd like more information on Jim, visit the show notes page at archetypist.com/change, and there you'll find more information on his amazing course called Embracing the Grace of Change, in which you can get 20% off with a special code there. And thanks again for listening, and we always appreciate your spending your time with us. So reach out to us on Twitter or Facebook, or send us an email. We'd like to know what you think. Until next time, have a great rest of 2015.